Hi, glad you guys are here. You're going to be doing a lot of discussing today, but we want to ground your discussions with a little bit of information. This mythology that we'll call the blue mythology is culturally reinforced at almost every given opportunity. So this presentation is kind of an opportunity to try to break through that and ask some questions that us as especially white Americans, which many of you are not used to asking. So you guys have probably heard of some of the more famous examples of police brutality and violent killings of black people, like Michael Brown in Ferguson, Freddie Gray in Baltimore, Philando Castile in the Twin Cities, and the list goes on and on. Maybe you've even heard of some of the more egregious examples of racism in policing, like the Baltimore Department of Justice report, which uncovered gross malfeasance within the Baltimore Police Department. Rough rides, like the type that broke Freddie Gray's neck, totally neglected sexual assault investigations. Maybe you've heard of, in Chicago, the John Burge torture ring. John Burge was a Chicago police commander who tortured and sent to prison 100 black men and got off with a 4-year sentence for perjury. So one of the questions hopefully you'll be asking throughout this presentation is, can we have a system, a policing and prison system, that doesn't have these examples of racism and police brutality? So this presentation tries to explore that from its roots. We're not going to all come up with the same conclusions, but this idea of whether the system is reformable or we are morally and practically required to start anew is something that hopefully at least comes to mind.
So, taking a look at history, there's really no credible interpretation of the facts that allow for the conclusion that the police were created to protect us or to uphold justice. Starting at the beginning, this takes us to the early 19th century, and in the South, vigilantism and slave patrols, and in the North, night watches and private for-profit policing. In the North, in the 1830s, night watches, which were small groups of men who were tasked with doing pretty much what their title implies, were transformed into official government-supported police departments. So as industrialization gained full swing, masters of industry increasingly pressured local governments to take over as enforcers of social order. Early capitalists were not even particularly interested in crime at all, but rather were interested in a stable environment for business and a reliable workforces. So via taxes and political influence, the mercantile class successfully pressured governments into creating what one historian calls the professional quasi-military forces known as early police departments. Many of these new police forces had uniforms before anything much was officially spelled out about what exactly they had the power to do. Nevertheless, far from idle, the new police forces were called upon for tasks that really didn't have much to do with crime. Policing activities often involved control of the, quote, dangerous class, a category that included not only criminals but also homeless poor people, paupers and tramps.
Also around this time and up through the early 20th century, the de facto law enforcement system of the time were private for-profit police agencies like the infamous Pinkerton Agency. The main function of these agencies was to infiltrate labor unions and to break strikes, often by violent means. Again, at the behest of the mercantile class, the government took over this function also as the protectors of capital and suppressors of its organized resistance. In the South, slave patrols existed to apprehend runaway slaves, to terrorize slaves in order to prevent them from running away, and also to discipline slaves that broke plantation rules. These slave patrols became police departments in many southern cities. The Ku Klux Klan is also very integral to the origins of police forces, so much so that Congress passed the Third Force Act in 1871, barring the hiring by governmental agencies of Klan members. This was necessitated because of the commingling of the KKK and police departments. Madison was far from immune from this trend, and in fact, former chief of police detectives William McCormick recalled that in the early 1920s, most of the Madison Police Department were Klansmen.
Not coincidentally, prisons began to materialize into an organized system after the Civil War ended. There were prisons before the Civil War, but the prison system really took off after the end of the war. The first prisons, like Angola and Louisiana, were former slave plantations. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery except as punishment for a crime. Local governments began passing the Black Codes, which were sets of laws targeted at ex-slaves. These included vagrancy laws, the precursors to what we now know of as loitering and curfew violations, and trivial violations that were treated as felonies and incurring lengthy sentences. Also, the convict leasing system began, wherein states would lease out the labor of prisoners to private corporations and wealthy white people. Chain gangs, which were banned in the 1950s but later introduced, were used, and now in some places are still used. So just as the overt slavery before it, convict labor was crucial to the economies of the southern states.
So these are some quotes that kind of speak to the importance of the similarities between slavery before it, prison labor and Reconstruction after it, and then the although debtors' prisons are technically illegal, the system in which poor, especially Black people, are imprisoned for trivial offenses. Today, you've probably heard of the prison industrial complex, where governments and private entities continue to collaborate in order to exploit the captive labor of people who were convicted of crimes. All manner of industries and companies ranging from Victoria's Secret to AT&T reap profits off of the free and cheap labor of inmates around the country.
In the highly acclaimed The New Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander demonstrates how the prisons continue the legacy of the Jim Crow era and how the police, politicians, and the judiciary work together to disenfranchise millions of Black people, virtually ending their ability to function productively in society because of the lingering ramifications of having been convicted of a crime. While the targeting of Blacks had always been an essential component of the policing and prison system, Nixon became the first among many politicians to use tough-on-crime rhetoric to boost his campaign. This rhetoric targeted white people's fears of Black people, but increasingly as the years passed, the ideas became only implicitly racialized so that criminal status became a stand-in for race. Ronald Reagan massively amped up the war on drugs, reallocating funds to police departments around the country and diverting it, especially from education. In what was once considered a conspiracy theory, the CIA at this time colluded with drug traffickers to bring crack cocaine to the Black lower-class communities already being targeted by the war on drugs. And so in this way, the crack epidemic that supposedly justified the war on drugs was manufactured after the war's inception.
So that's a bit of the history, just a drop in the bucket, of course. But if we fast forward today and we think about what do the police do for us today? Do they truly serve and protect us? Do they protect our bodies? Do they serve us? Do they uphold justice? So if you consider the hopefully by now well-known statistic that a Black person is killed by the police every 28 hours, hopefully you already have some trepidation about the answer to that question. But what about even for us white people? What do the police do in general? So if you think about it in a logical manner, just think about the logic behind it. The police are a reactive force. They respond to a supposed crime. They arrest somebody for committing a crime. So by that logic, they don't prevent violence. They don't prevent crime. They don't prevent us from being harmed. When the police do try to delve into the realm of prevention, you get things like stop and frisk, and we all know how that goes. You get things like community policing, which is a more positively touted example of crime prevention done by the police. But community policing is not statistically effective and has also been met with resistance by the communities upon whom it has been forced. So we need to think very critically about community policing as well. Data in general about correlation of police and crime is generally unconclusive, but, quote, most consistent findings across studies is that increasing police numbers has no effect on crime levels. So think about that for a second and what that says about what the police do to prevent crime and to keep us safe. We do know, on the other hand, that prisons increase crime. Somebody is more likely to commit a crime when they leave prison than they were when they went into prison. In fact, London School of Economics professor David Graeber has shown that only 10% of police time is spent on any sort of criminal matter. The other 90% is spent on various administrative codes, like where you can eat, sit, drink, park, sell things like untaxed cigarettes. If you break this down in Dane County and look at the arrest data here, of all of the arrests done in Dane County, 2% of those arrests are for violent offenses. So we already have only 10% of police time being spent on crime, and then breaking that, even that relatively small number down, only 2% of the arrests done are for keeping us safe. And again, that says nothing about actually preventing violence. That's just reacting to the fact of a violence that has occurred. Professor Graeber says, the police then are essentially just bureaucrats with weapons. Their main role in society is to bring the threat of physical force, even death, into situations where it would never have been otherwise invoked, such as the enforcement of civic ordinances about the sale of untaxed cigarettes. And that, of course, is a reference to Eric Garner in New York, who was asphyxiated because of his refusal to submit to police requests. So more strong words from Michael Denzel Smith in The Nation that I'll leave for you to read and consider. So hopefully by now, at least you have taken in this information and have asked yourself some questions that maybe you weren't really aware to ask yourself before. Hopefully we've at least jarred you into considering another perspective on the police and whether it is an institution that is reformable, on how urgent it is that changes be made to that system. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your living room conversation.